Welcome, welcome. Got a big group joining us today, so we're going to give us about 2 minutes and then we will get started promptly. For the early joiners, you know our typical routine. I want to make sure you can hear us and see the screen. So hopefully you can. So maybe, thank you, Ryan. You're a past attendee. So I usually say to raise their hand. So he's already raised his hand. That's perfect. Thanks, guys. We've all had enough Zoom fun where we do these and people can't see the screen for 15 minutes. So usually not a good thing. Although not seeing my head might be a additive bonus. Got a good group today. Get started in 1 minute. We're going to go ahead and get started. Got a question that came in asking about sort of us in Florida. I appreciate that very much. I am stuck in Idaho, which is not a bad place to be stuck. But when your wife and kids are in Florida, I'm not getting any husband points right now. I will assure you that. And Paul's in Florida as well. So, but overall, family's good. I appreciate your asking. So, all things that we have to deal with from time to time. But Brian Klontz with Charitable Solutions. Really glad to have everybody here today. We'll have Phil and Paul taking us through the Charitable Remainder Trust's top 5 unique conundrums and solutions. Always good to have solutions to conundrums. And this is being recorded. So a couple housekeeping notes, as many of you have attended past ones know, we don't tend to send out the slide deck, but they will get, you all will get a link for the full webinar here. We have about 25 or 30, I think now, all on the Charitable Solutions website across all kinds of different topics, again, all free. And then we will also be collecting and sort of consolidating, if you will, all the Q&A that comes in during this session. So we'll take all the ones from the Tuesday webinar, all the ones from today, and then we have a little format that Paul and Phil will be able to answer those questions. So when you actually get the link for the webinar itself, you'll also have the Q&A. So we try to consolidate that to make that very helpful too. So with Charitable Solutions, I have done a pretty horrible job of sort of letting people know who we are and what we do. Most people know us for one service, and then 3-4 years later, they say, we have no idea you do these other things. So we take 5 or 6 minutes here on the front end just to explain some of the other odd things that we do. So our mission is to help make charitable gifts happen that otherwise wouldn't. And we do that really in 6 primary ways. The emergency assistance stuff that we're doing right now with Hurricane, we'll not talk about today because we're so busy with that. Do a lot of professional advisor CE, hence why I'm here in Ketchum, Idaho today. And certainly Paul and Phil do a lot of these as well, both for donors, staff, boards, etc. Then on the appraisal side, we have a team that does qualified appraisals. I'm doing them nonstop right now for the Always Fun October 15th deadline for virtual currency and life insurance. The rest of our team handles the business appraisals, and we sort of our tagline is, if you can give it to charity, we can appraise it. We were stumped about a month ago. Somebody wanted to do a horse, couldn't do a horse, but everything else we've been able to do, bourbon, artwork, coins, so anything that could be donated that requires a qualified appraiser to complete a qualified appraisal, our team can handle. So that's been a sort of rapidly growing service area for us, both for CRTs, topic of today, but obviously for outright gifts as well. And on the gift annuity front, we sort of have 2 different lines of business there. One is gift annuity risk management. So we do about maybe 15 to 20 CGA risk pool audits a year, have an actuary on staff, sort of my background as well, and really truly stress test additional pools to be able to identify any potential risks within the pool, mitigation strategies there. And then also, to the extent there are very large concentrated risks, we do reinsurance design and brokerage for various carriers as well, where that makes sort of sense too. So that's on the CGA risk management side. And then sort of the ultimate risk management is to avoid the risk. And you can do that certainly by using an outside third-party charity. Ours is the National Gift Annuity Foundation. So we have about 650 contracts now. About 300 charities have referred in at least one closed gift annuity contract. And the key point is that we handle the asset, the liability, all of the sort of sausage making that goes along with gift annuity administration. And then most importantly, 100% of the residuum is then passed back to the charity or charities that the donor was trying to give to in the first place. So we have very large, again, independent pool and licensed in all 50 states, important as well. And then the final piece by far, actually, maybe Paul, if you can go back one, final piece is on the non-cash stuff. I know I did it a very odd way, sort of right to bottom to left, so I get it. So the non-cash asset risk management is our primary activity, about half of what we do. So our full team now, including Paul and Phil, as new team members, which I'll introduce more formally here in a moment. But we have about 28 people now total. And the non-cash area gets about half of our work. So we do two things. One is direct consulting to charities that are trying to take in a non-cash asset themselves, sort of more directly. And then by far the majority are where, again, from a risk management perspective, that they don't wish to take in the asset. And so we have Decami Foundation and Decami Asset Trust that can take in those gifts on behalf, in essence, of other charities or independent, standalone, donor-advised fund. But we do the due diligence, all the acknowledgement, compliance, and during the holding period to manage that asset to be able to maximize those sales proceeds. So most importantly here too, we're doing a lot more, Paul and Phil in particular, sort of leading this area around CRTs, hence the topic again today. Maybe Paul, if you go to that next slide, I'll hit this pretty quickly. Those of you who have attended past webinars, I've sort of done this year, but without going into a lot of detail, very important is really the thing in the parentheses, the thing I should be bolding, frankly. 100% of the donations that we receive to Decami are after they've been referred by other charities that are unable or unwilling or super quick turnaround time or risk for whatever reason, they're otherwise going to decline the gift. So we're only working behind those charities and being able to capture some of these gifts otherwise that would have been declined. So you can see there about 261 received last year. That's about one a day, obviously. Average donation here, if you sort of divide 261 by the roughly 1.2 billion, is about 4.4 million. Our average fee on that last year was about 1.35%, which then means about 98.5 cents on the dollar. Same like the gift annuities, we don't manage anything once it's liquid. So it's a donor advised fund with a standing grant recommendation for it to be granted then the net proceeds back to the charity or charities, again, that they were trying to give to in the first place. So you can see real estate and so forth. These are all major outright gifts. These are not CRTs or CGAs. That's a whole other sort of bucket. And so we certainly are doing more and more, working on an S Corp right now for about $1 million gift annuity as an example. So they're coming up more and more. And obviously that's why we wanted to have this topic today. So as I pass it over here to Paul, Paul will go through the agenda. I've known Paul, I think, at least 18, 20 years. Same with Bill. And both have joined in the last month. And so this is for them to sort of brain dump all of their expertise and knowledge, hopefully to all of you that you'll appreciate and enjoy around CRTs. But most importantly, too, it's sort of introducing them sort of to the charitable solution community. And they're really going to be focusing on both national charities, but more specifically sort of in obviously the higher education and college space. So Paul's been doing it 25 years through multiple colleges, in particular, University of Florida's most recent perch, leading that gift planning area. And then Phil, 30 years sort of plus now, most all of that with Duke. So love to have friends that have known a long, long time and really respect and learn a lot from, and hopefully you can do the same. So with that, Paul, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you, Brian. And good afternoon, everyone. We're glad that you're with us. This is just a quick walkthrough of the agenda. We're going to touch on CRT Primer a little bit before we get into really the meat of the program. Really, for the most part, just as I have done over the years, picked up on some phraseology and ways to describe CRTs to donors, which if you can't do that, you're not going to be able to get to having these non-cash asset conversations, which Phil's going to walk through some real world case studies. So we want to get to that, and then time permitting, I'm going to go over testamentary CRTs funded with IRAs on the heels of the Secure Act and the proposed regs that came out from the IRS this year, which makes testamentary CRTs funded with retirement assets extremely attractive. Phil's going to then talk about the pros and cons of your organization serving as a trustee or choosing not to trustee. And then again, time permitting, we'll get into the discussion about early termination of CRTs and talk a little bit about how we work with you at Charitable Solutions, whether you want to be a trustee for CRTs or whether you don't want to be, and so that we can help you in either one of those scenarios. So with that, just one thing real quick. I wanted to share with you some phraseology that I first learned at the very first training seminar that I went to that I still use today when I talk to donors about charitable remainder trusts. And it came from Charles Schultz. It was my first training class at Crescendo. And he got a big pen out of his pocket and he said, BIC, I want you to remember that acronym because those are the three most important features of a charitable CRT, generally speaking. The B stands for you bypass the capital gain, assuming that you're funding it with a long-term gain asset, which in most cases we generally are with CRTs. So you bypass the capital gain because the CRT, if you follow all of the rules of 664 of the Internal Revenue Code, the CRT is tax exempt. So that's benefit number one. Benefit number two is the income. So that income generally is going to go back to the donor or the grant or the person that initially created the trust. It certainly doesn't have to be that way. But if it is for another type of loved one other than a spouse, then you're technically making a gift of that income. So you can either put it in your will that you reserve the right to revoke that income so it's not an immediate gift, or you can file a 709 return and just go ahead and make that as a gift today, the present value of those income payments. And then C is the charitable income tax deduction that you earn as a result of establishing a CRT. So that, again, is easily explained by saying it's the full fair market value of the asset, but minus the actuarial value of the life income payments that are going to be received. And another way of saying that is the present value of the remainder interest. That's going to be your income tax charitable deduction. So those are really the three features. The BIC, I think, is a time-tested way of describing this. There are two different types of payment structures. CRATs don't get a lot of love, especially they're not going to get a lot of love or attention with non-cash assets. So I don't want to spend a lot of time there. I was talking to Phil about this earlier this week. There's 50 years of private letter rulings and revenue rulings and all these things with CRTs. We're not going to touch on them all today, but we will cover a lot of ground. I'm going to focus more on Charitable Remainder Unitrust because they're going to be the necessary vehicle that you use when you're funding with a non-cash asset, which you'll see why very shortly. But one of the rules that are applicable to all CRTs that you should keep in mind is that the value of the remainder interest in a CRT as determined by the 75/20 rate, which we'll touch on briefly, must be at least 10% of the fair market value of the property contributed initially when funding the trust. Now, if the CRUT allows for additional contributions, which the specimen documents from the IRS allow additional contributions, then you really should make sure that every additional contribution passes that 10% test along with it. So those are kind of some of the general rules about CRTs, and then rules that pertain to CRATs versus CRUTs. The sample forms in 2005, the revenue procedures, they allow for all different types of unit trusts. Of course, the standard charitable remainder unit trust, net income with makeup charitable remainder unit trust, and then they flip charitable remainder unit trust, which I want to spend a little bit of time on as I segue this to Phil, as he starts to discuss how CRTs are generally funded with non-cash assets. One other thing to keep in mind is that Charitable Remainder Trust, because they were part of the Tax Act of 1969, pretty much everything that was associated with that are subject to private foundation rules. They're considered subject to those. And I won't go into all 6 of them, but I think the top 3 are important to keep in mind. First one is you're going to butt up against self-dealing, especially when you're funding with non-cash assets, closely held businesses, certainly. And so a private foundation is constrained from financial transactions with persons who create, control, or fund that organization. So it imposes penalties on individuals who are considered disqualified persons who are engaged in these prohibited transactions. And so those would be like the donor's spouse, children, grandchildren, and really any entity in which any of these individuals have specified levels of involvement. So a penalty can be imposed on the trustee, though, which is important to know. If there are prohibited transactions, although the trustee can avoid a penalty for a reasonable cause on the advice of counsel, but it's something that you need to keep in mind as a trustee. Number 2 there, the minimum distribution. Won't spend a lot of time there. You all know that private foundations are subject to a 5% minimum distribution payout each year, and that's where essentially that comes from for CRTs. So it has to be a minimum of 5%, a maximum of 50%. Again, obviously, in order to pass, actuarially 10% needs to go to charity. Excess business holdings, again, you're going to butt up against this one, perhaps with non-cash assets. And that's generally that a private foundation and its disqualified persons may own no more than 20% of a business or enterprise's voting or ownership interest. So those are really the private foundation rules. You want to have a checklist as you go through those, especially when you're funding a CRT with these non-cash types of assets. One other one that I want to mention here, which is not a private foundation rule, but it's one that is clearly important, Phil will discuss, is UBIT, unrelated business income tax. A CRT, as I mentioned before, the whole B, the bypass, it's not subject to federal income tax. So it can sell the asset free of paying any income tax. And then, of course, the income is then distributed to the income beneficiaries on that 4-tier scale, worst to first, ordinary income first, and on, long-term gain, tax-exempt income, and then return of principal. But the CRT itself doesn't pay income, but it will pay unrelated business income tax, which is defined as income derived from an unrelated trade or business that is regularly carried on. And guess what? A CRT doesn't engage in its own charitable activities. So therefore, it can never have business income that's not UBIT. So consequently, all business income in a CRT constitutes UBIT. Now, prior to 2008, that was a death sentence for the CRT, a dime of UBIT, it would disqualify the CRT. After 2008 or so, that time frame, it wouldn't necessarily disqualify the CRT, but 100% of the unrelated business income tax is taxable. So I'm not sure that's much of an upgrade, but it's something that we have to manage and navigate around. And at Charitable Solutions, there's a variety of ways that we can do that. Phil will walk through some examples of how to work through the unrelated business income tax issue. Present value of the remainder interest. Again, most of you probably know these things, so I'll move through it pretty quickly, just so you know that there are proposed regs right now to adjust the 75/20 rates. I think the last time they were updated, I think, was 2009. And the IRS couldn't move forward in 2019 because the CDC hadn't issued its tables yet at that time. So that's coming around, and it does impact the charitable deduction. But the most important thing that impacts the charitable deduction is the 75/20 rate, which is now over 4%. It's pretty much aligned with the 10-year Treasury. And the best way to explain this to a donor is that this is the IRS's investment assumption of the performance of your trust from the beginning of your trust till the end of your trust. So if your trust is paying 5% and the IRS assumes that the investment experience is going to be a 4% annual return, then over time that's going to erode the principal, but it's going to arrive at what the actuarial present value of the remainder interest is. So because it's a split interest gift, that 75-20 rate is going to be the driver to determine how much goes to charity and how much is really going to the income beneficiaries to arrive at your charitable income tax deduction. So I mentioned earlier the aspects of a flip charitable remainder unit trust. Now this is, we have 25 years of the flip now, but back in 1997, before that, when you funded a non-cash asset in a CRT, you definitely had to use a unitrust, but there was no such thing as a flip provision. So all charitable remainder unitrusts that were set up with non-cash assets were essentially set up as net income CRTs. And really before the 1990s, that wasn't really an issue for the income beneficiaries because the net income was pretty generous in the high bond markets, high yield bond markets and high dividends from stocks. But that became pretty unattractive over time. So by 1997, we got some guidance from the IRS that said, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to allow a new provision in the code that allows individuals to donate non-cash assets to a charitable remainder unit trust. And it's going to be set up as a net income charitable remainder unit trust initially. It could be a net income with makeup as well. But we will create several triggers that can convert that charitable remainder trust to a standard CRT. So that's essentially what you have. Just walking you through one example. Let's say that you have a donor who has some undeveloped real estate. He transfers it in the fall of 2021 to a flip charitable remainder unit trust. And he gets an appraisal at that time. So based on that appraisal, he's able to take his income tax deduction in 21. If it's vacant land, he could get net income. But in our example, let's say that he doesn't get any net income at all. And let's say that the land sells in the trust in October of 2022. And so the trust then is able to flip on January of 2023. Hypothetically, we have $950,000, which is the net proceeds after the sale of the real estate following expenses. And now he's off and running. He's getting 5% on his standard CRT. That's going to be revalued on December 31st of every year, and the remainder goes to charity. So with that, the flip charitable remainder trust is essentially going to be the signature tool that all of these non-cash assets get funded with that Phil's about to describe. So Phil, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Paul. First, for point of clarity, we'll be covering the high points in a rather brief time span. So assume I'm talking about gifts to a public charity, not a private foundation. And also when I mentioned cost basis and some of those issues, if we're doing a lifetime CRUT, those are issues. If we're doing a testamentary CRUT, a lot of those are eliminated by the stepped up cost basis of death. So first, factors to consider when contributing real estate to a flip CRUT. And I do suggest that any charity doing this have a gift review and acceptance committee or whatever you want to call it. If you don't have enough internal staff to do this, then try to form one with a local realtor and a local real estate attorney and others that may, be part of your advisory group. You don't want to fly solo on these. Number one, what type of flip CRUT? As Paul mentioned, these can start out as a net income or a net income with makeup. I read a lot of postings online that say it has to be a NIM CRUT. It does not. It needs to be based on the donor's goals. In some cases, we'll be funding a flip CRUT with highly appreciated real estate, but the flip event's not actually the sale of the real estate, it's the retirement of the donor. So, does the donor want to buy a beach house at that point? Do they need the income? Do they not want a big chunk of principal coming out of the CRUT in a makeup portion to up their income tax that year? Just make sure you understand their goals. Number two, type of property. Is it debt-free? Is it commercial? Does it have an operating trade or business? Farm, unimproved land? Does it include oil, gas, and mineral rights? We'll talk about one of those. Is it a personal residence? 99 out of 100 of these, you tell the donor to just use their home sale exclusion, but there are those where the personal residence is so highly appreciated, it makes sense to look at a flip CRUT. Is the property marketable? Don't take any white elephants. You know this. If it's a gift to a charity or CRT, it's not a magical solution. We've had donors tell us that we could get a big donor to our charity to buy it, or we were a charity so we could demand a higher price, or all sorts of ideas they come up with or someone suggests to it. Again, we're not a magician. Number 4, this is the monster. Are there potential environmental hazards of the property? Is there pollution, wetlands, asbestos, mold, anything else that can pop up? Number 5, has the donor owned the real estate for longer than 1 year? Duh. Is it long-term capital gain property? Again, once in a blue moon, somebody will come along that's basically trying to flip property, and they're in a hot market that gets worse. Number 6, another obvious one, mortgage or debt on the property. As Paul mentioned, debt on property in a CRT is 100% taxable, unrelated business taxable income, or income tax. We call it UBIT. Number 7, restrictions on the property. Sadly, many donors have amnesia when it comes to your questions about easements, right-of-ways, zoning restrictions, whatever. Just, before you jump in too deep, understand those as part of your due diligence. Number 8 is the donor under a legally binding commitment to sell the property. They can have 20 buyers lined up at the door. They just can't have an agreement to sell the property that's legally binding. And handshake agreements don't count. A man is not as good as his word. Number 9, who owns the property? An individual, sole proprietorship, husband, wife, C corporation, S corporation, LLC, limited partnership. There can be all sorts of entities involved. So next, let's jump into a few real world examples that we've been through. So we're often asked to weave straw into gold with real estate. And again, we'll use a flip CRUT in each of these cases. Now, whenever practical and possible, I always try to get the donor to be the initial trustee. My sales pitch on that one that makes sense to most is that he or she can control the timing and the price of sale. They often will accuse the charity of not getting enough out of it or selling it too soon or whatever. Well, problem eliminated. You can be the initial trustee. You have complete control in that case. They are already in the line of title. That means if there is an environmental issue, they're on the hook either way, and it keeps the charity off the hook, and most donors will understand that. And then there's no cost of a phase 1, much less a phase 2, which would be where we would drop out, but a phase 1 environmental review for the charity. If it's long-time residential real estate, often the phase 1 will be bypassed. So let's look at the first case. I had a wonderful Pennsylvania donor owned property on which said a Jiffy Lube. Another national chain, a tire center, wanted to acquire the property. So we had a buyer in the wings. Now, the donor very much wanted to make an outright gift to the university charity, but the university was not going to touch a property with an oil change station on it with a 10-foot pole. Was not going to happen. So after much negotiation, and great lawyer did a lot of due diligence looking at ways to transfer it to an LLC or whatever else, we finally got the donor to serve as the initial trustee on a flip CRUT. The property sold to the buyer in the wings. Everyone was happy. And then with about a year later, the donor disclaimed his income interest, so the money could go to work for the charity as he initially wanted. Now, number 2, had a property, an apartment complex in Laguna Beach, California. So it's a community property state. Again, no big deal. Just be aware and use a slightly different charitable remainder trust form. In that case, the donor was literally a PhD rocket scientist. He was demanding and had multiple expectations, not all of which we were ready to meet or could meet legally or otherwise. So he wanted a sale price to document his deduction. And we kept telling him he couldn't do that, but he wanted to do it to save the cost of the appraisal, he kept saying. He kept telling us another outside successor trustee could promise a 12% return guaranteed, told him no way we could do that. He wanted me to act as his attorney to transfer the real estate and assorted other duties. And I explained the conflict of interest and that I wasn't licensed in California and a myriad of other things, but he still kept trying to push this. He also wanted the CRT to fund a program at the university immediately, not wait for the remainder. His niece was his CPA, and she was great. but she had never dealt with the Charitable Remainder Trust. She was a little overwhelmed. So anyway, after much negotiation, the donors donated a 20% outright undivided interest, 80% to a flip CRUT with the donor as the initial trustee. There were a number of UBIT issues, including a coin laundry, which we shut down before making the gifts. Then the property sold within a couple of months. And I strongly encourage the donors to use the other successor trustee. By the grace of God, they did. So the donor was, happy for a couple of years. Then he came back and asked the university I was employed with to serve as trustee because not everything promised had been delivered. Finally, Smoky Mountain property, 200 plus pristine acres. It was gorgeous, had mountain meadows, timber, and an old cabin. The donors were a retired minister and his wife, and they'd inherited the property decades ago. Now, they had 2 adult daughters they did not want to disinherit. The daughters had good jobs and income. And one daughter was employed with the National Park Service, which complicated things because she wanted it donated to the National Park Service, which would mean no CRT income. And it would also require an act of Congress. We got beyond that hurdle. So in the end, the donor, with his attorney's assistance, who was a great guy, just did mostly real estate, not so much in charitable trust, as he said. So we were able to hold hands and get through this. But each daughter got a 25% undivided interest, which they held for a wee bit and then donated to the university charity. The parents' 50% interest went to a flip CRUT for the charity as trustee because they were too old and unable to really handle this. And their attorney was great, but just wasn't comfortable handling this. And we were not concerned after an environmental review that we had issues there. So the donor also wanted the property preserved as, again, timber and mountain meadows and elk habitat and so forth. But again, with much negotiation, he agreed not to restrict the conservation easement because this would have greatly reduced the value of the property. And the reality was conservation charities didn't want the property restricted. So they sometimes want to exchange properties. In this case, they did not. But within a year or so, we sold the property to a conservation charity. And they wound up putting it into, with multiple other properties around it, into a natural wildlife habitat. Happy ending once again. All right, next slide. All right, I'll just briefly touch on this because we don't have a lot of time. Some of the properties we've been offered, overvalued coal property, 3,200 West Virginia acres with surface rights and coal rights. The donor had a glossy appraisal and lots of plats and impressive data, the value of the property, $56 million. We had friends that were in the coal business, wonderful donors. They helped us get a more realistic assessment of the value at $3 million. Now, the donor later apologized to me and just explained that, he had borrowed a lot of money from banks based on the $56 million appraisal. And sadly, I had to tell him that wasn't our issue. We could not help. Now, coastal wetlands, we run into on a pretty regular basis, especially after the Great Recession. There were a lot of coastal developments that didn't work out. Now, in one of those more recent years, the donor claimed the large property had 80% development lots and 20% wetlands. It was near Wilmington, North Carolina. We were a little concerned about market conditions and carrying costs and so forth. And, our local contacts, a real estate agent and a local banker, said it was more like 20% development lots and 80% wetlands. So in the end, we walked away from this one and had to reject it repeatedly. And sadly, a church on the West Coast took it, and they were soon thereafter, according to newspaper articles, surprised to receive a bill for $876,572 in county sewer assessments and a big property tax bill. So those come along. I guess there are other cases where they just don't work out because politically you can't get them through your charity. Someone has a worry. There was a very valuable 200 plus acre property in Northern Virginia. Sadly, on a small portion, it had a long time illegal dump site, old refrigerators and this and that. A car may be dumped in there at some point. But, our solution offered was that, we could carve out that piece of property, let the owner try to remediate it, clean it up, and get it re-inspected. But that solution was not accepted by the charity involved. They just were a little too nervous. So we had to politely decline the property. So yes, sometimes I do cry myself to sleep. All right, let's talk a little bit about closely held businesses. First off, for Charitable Remainder Trust, a sole proprietorship doesn't really work. A charity, much less a Charitable Remainder Trust, cannot be involved in a sole proprietorship. Only an individual or husband and wife. Now, if they're shutting down the business, those can usually be distributed to the owner, the sole proprietor, and they can contribute assets. Not a big deal as long as they're debt-free. Inventory and other hot assets can be a bit of an issue. Number two, closely held C corporation shares. These are generally good for CRTs because any UBIT is captured at the corporate level. It is not passed through in the form of dividends or capital gains. So C corporations also tend to be the preference for some big hits like, technology companies starting out that think they're going to go to an IPO, or other companies that we work with. So you need up front to figure out how the flip CRUT is going to sell or liquidate. If it's going to be an IPO, that's great. The donor may want to wait post IPO if it's a stock for stock acquisition. But if it's going to be part cash, they may want to go pre-IPO to contribute it to the flip CRUT. Sometimes there's a corporate buyback, maybe to transfer wealth to the children from the parents as part of the corporate buyback or bailout. Sometimes there's a sale or merger, just with a larger company. Now, if there is some sort of tender offer, you've got to see whether there's board approval or regulatory approval that's not yet complete. So you don't have a completed sale. You can still do the gift. S corporations, you can't put these into a charitable remainder trust. It forfeits the S election and makes every other S corporation shareholder upset, except there are cases where it's a family or a single member S corporation. In that case, it can work. You're usually going to have some sort of buyback program through a sale of assets, on rare occasions, a sale of the S stock. Now, Brian Klontz noted earlier that a charitable gift annuity may be a better solution for a life income gift funded with the actual S corporation stock. So you really should look at both to see which works better. LLCs, these come in many forms. They can be a partnership or a corporation. For example, this week I got a bill from Duke Energy. It's Duke Energy Carolinas LLC. Some of these are simple real estate investors using a partnership type LLC to hold building lots or undeveloped property. If it's debt-free, no UBIT, these can work great. A single member LLC can be disregarded, but a 2+ member LLC is a partnership. And sometimes there are restrictions on the transfer of these. Now, you can't usually sell back property or assets distributed back to the LLC because that's self-dealing. But there are a lot of private letter rulings out there, Paul mentioned. One allows an S corporation to donate an LLC with investment securities for charitable remainder trust with income to the shareholder. Again, this can be sliced a number of ways. Now, partnerships, limited partnerships and general partnerships. Again, I've not done any of these with the general partnership because the general partner is 100% liable, and that can be a problem. Where these work great, and I've done millions of dollars of, or when it's a publicly traded limited partnership. A lot of natural energy companies, natural gas companies are set up as publicly traded LPs for tax purposes. Another famous LP is the Boston Celtics Limited Partnership. Again, there are a lot of private letter rulings out there. Some one allowed a limited partnership to establish a charitable remainder trust with payments back to the limited partnership. But in some situations, these do work. You just have to be careful. You always want to ask the CPA about hot assets for S corporations or LLCs, like accounts receivable, inventory, and others that may reduce the donor's income tax deduction. And next, there we go. Art of collectible, I'll spend about 60 seconds. These can work when the asset is highly appreciated. The second question is it inherited, an investment, or you sometimes get an artist wanting to use a CRT to sell artwork they created that's valuable, and that's not often doable. But inherited or investment art can work great. The great advantage is it avoids a 28% federal capital gains tax at sale, plus any applicable state income tax and local income tax. And generally, with wealthy donors, they'll also avoid the 3.8% Medicare surtax in many cases that would apply to the sale. The deduction, this is the price, the deduction is based on cost basis, and it's not deductible until the asset sells. So just put that in writing, understand up front. But if it's $1 million painting that the donor bought at a yard sale for $100 and you run into these situations, then it can work great. You'll see cases out there with collectibles that were sold. One university CRT sold an Aston Martin for about $1 million more. Another did a Corvette, same dollar amount. I worked with a doctor in San Francisco who wanted to sell his lifelong comic book collection. Some of the comics were worth thousands of dollars. Put it into a charitable trust and sell it. We did not want to be trustee, obviously, and wanted him to work with his own specialist who helped him with his collection. Sports memorabilia, I think I saw last week that a Michael Jordan jersey sold for like $11.4 million, but this is a growing business. And again, some of these pieces are acquired for more modest amounts and then sold for 10 times that much, so that can work. Next up is Paul, back to you.
Okay, thank you, Phil. That was great. So I'm going to pivot to a very different topic about testamentary CRTs and this kind of buzz around the idea of funding retirement assets with testamentary CRTs. So we know that retirement assets are good for charity because essentially these are one of those types of assets that as a non-charitable beneficiary, you are going to pay the income tax once you make the distribution out of these types of inherited plans. It's called income in respect of a decedent. And as a result of that, we know that that's one of the tools in our toolbox in terms of some type of tax mitigation as the benefit of leaving any type of bequest to charity. Because unless you have an estate of greater than 13 million if you're single or 26 million if you're married, you really don't have that estate tax incentive anymore. So now what we have seen though is I've been around long enough to remember when Congress and the IRS approved regs in 2001 and 2 to create what we nicknamed over the last 2 decades to be the stretch IRA. And in other words, as a non-charitable beneficiary, I could take determined to be a designated beneficiary. I could take a life expectancy payout. So that was nicknamed the stretch. Well, we know that the Secure Act that passed in December of 2019 basically eliminated the stretch for the majority of beneficiaries. Now, how the Secure Act did that is it didn't amend anything in the regs about all this history of the rules that we have about minimum distributions for beneficiaries, but it added a new section. And that section is 401A9H. And basically all that says is that it says that that the B3, which is 401A9B3, that's where it talks about the life expectancy payout. It's been in the code now for 20 years. It says it shall only apply now to eligible designated beneficiaries. Well, who are they? Most of you have probably done your homework on this already to know that there are 5 categories of eligible designated beneficiaries. Obviously, a surviving spouse is the only one who can actually roll an IRA from a surviving spouse into her own IRA. And then we have a minor child, which is defined, minor is defined as anyone who turns age 21. And then they have 10 years to defer until they have to empty that out, the IRA, inherited IRA out at age 80, at age 31. We have individuals who are disabled or chronically ill as determined by the IRS, and they have to have those afflictions before the IRA owner passed away. And then if the 5th one is any person who is less than 10 years younger than the decedent. That is your list of individuals who would still qualify for the stretch. And so for the rest of us who would inherit an IRA, maybe from a parent, we are going to be a designated beneficiary, but not an eligible designated beneficiary. Furthermore, the proposed regs, which I mentioned at the very beginning, were, I think, a jaw dropper for the most planners across the country. Now, these are not final regs yet, but they're giving us a good idea of where the IRS is heading with this. Their basic, their interpretation in the regs of all of this was to say that if the IRA owner dies prior to age 72, which is the time they would start their required beginning date, then that is true, that you have 10 years, this whole 10 years of deferral of that inherited IRA before you have to empty out that IRA. The ugly surprise from these proposed regs were that if the IRA owner is over the age of 72 and they have already started their required minimum distributions, then not only does the beneficiary, designated beneficiary, have to take the entire distribution in year 10, but in years 1 through 9, they have to take their minimum distributions based on their own life expectancy, just like before the Secure Act. So that was a huge, I think, surprise for most of us, especially because, you know, the reality is most people are going to live until age 72. So that's really going to be the standard type of planning. And really, in all the reading, and I've read Natalie Choate, I've listened to a lot of her seminars. She's the greatest of all time in this category. There's really not a lot of daylight for creative planning around bringing the stretch back for designated beneficiaries, except for a testamentary charitable remainder trust. Now, there's a number of ways that you can set up a testamentary charitable remainder trust and fund it with retirement assets. By and large, the easiest way to do it is going to be to set it up as an intentionally revocable charitable remainder trust, which you can do. And you can set that up so that that would be funded and then become irrevocable at the death of the IRA owner. So it's very clean to do. There are states that have prohibit dry trusts that are irrevocable. So you want, that's one of the reasons why you want to set it up as intentionally revocable at the beginning. You fund it with a nominal $10, but you say in the trust that the trust doesn't have to file returns or make income payments until it becomes irrevocable. So that's essentially kind of the guidance that the IRS is giving us. We've got 2 private letter rulings over time that fit the exact description of funding a charitable remainder trust with retirement plan assets. I walked through this on Tuesday, and I think it's an important point to make. And this is something that we're going to have on our website at Plan Giving Interactive in the not too distant future, these calculations where you can show donors, 3 different scenarios. Scenario 1 is that, say that you've got a 50-year-old child who inherits an IRA from mom or dad, and let's say they've got 35 years, until they pass away at age 85. So in scenario 1, they just cash in the IRA right away. Okay, but they are wise enough to turn around and reinvest that money. And on an assumption, I think I use of 7% rate of return. Scenario number 2 is that they're smart enough to defer for the 10 years. Well, now we know that if the IRA owner is over the 72, that's not even an option likely. The beneficiary is going to have to take payments in years 1 through 9. So that's going to present a drag on scenario 2, which after I get the calculations updated, I submit that scenario 2 and scenario 3 are almost going to be neck and neck, which is in scenario 3 there, my dividing line is the life income payouts to that 50-year-old over 35 years of CRT payments. Again, all the investment assumptions are the same in scenario 1, 2, and 3. But look at the charitable impact. Scenario 1 and 2 have no charitable impact. So when we get the calculation updated and we assume that the IRA owner is over the age of 72, I really think that line of the benefit to the life income beneficiaries versus scenario 2 is going to be almost neck and neck. So I think it presents a tremendous opportunity for these CRTs. I've already kind of touched on the most effective way and the cost-effective way to do this is to draft your trust to be intentionally revocable at the onset. You could set up a CRT during the lifetime of the IRA owner, the grantor. I've done that several times. They may fund it with 50 grand, 100 grand, and then they're going to leave a large bequest from their IRA directly to fund that CRT, which is great for the surviving spouse, maybe in a second marriage situation, or even for the kids. So those are primarily the best 2 ways to fund a testamentary CRT with retirement assets. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the testamentary CRT checklist because we've already kind of covered a lot of these in the primer. So I'm going to flip it back over to Phil to talk about kind of this fork in the road of, do you serve as trustee as an organization, or do you decide not to trustee? Phil?
All right, thank you, Paul. Yeah, for a charity to consider whether or not to serve as trustee, as opposed to having someone else do the work or refer them to their own attorney, you first have to ask, does state law allow it? I've been fortunate in Virginia, North Carolina, other states, state law would allow it. But also remember that a charitable remainder trust can elect the state law that applies to it. And there are a number of states with favorable trust laws where, you can have the donor be the initial trustee if illiquid assets are involved, but then there's a major trust company willing and ready to take over. And of course, Charitable Solutions can help you through these as well and serve as initial trustee on some of these. The pros to me of the charity being trustee, if they can, is quality control. I know some writers write otherwise. I don't agree. I think the charities and the donors' interest are aligned in this case. Both want to keep the setup cost and administrative costs low. Charities that do this often provide example charitable remainder trust documents, which sometimes the donors' attorneys aren't that familiar with and greatly appreciate it. Other times they have their own. But again, this can help keep costs low if they have example documents to provide. And they also shop administrative costs and shop different companies against each other based on services provided and try to keep the costs low and monitored every year. You don't get ripped off. B, another shared goal, they both want to grow the principal. To me, they're not competing as remainder beneficiary and income beneficiary. They want to grow the principal because that means a bigger annual CRUT payout to the income beneficiary, usually the donor, and a bigger remainder to the charity. Often charities that do this can provide multiple investment pools that are attractive and sort of pre-made. One, tax efficient fund, TESI is what we used to call it. Others have the option through a private letter ruling to invest in their endowment. We call that the endowment investment option. Again, more charities also do a fund that mirrors this without the PLR. And then you'll have a 50-50 offering or a 60-40 offering, equity to fixed income, and so forth. Now, the charity can earn more gifts via good work. At Duke University and Virginia Tech, I had great trust and estate teams, and their stewardship and good work really helped us get a lot more gifts down the road. It was a handoff of the first gift, and then they were involved, and sometimes you came in to answer difficult questions. And so confidence, when charities do this well during life, they earn more gifts, often testamentary gifts, but also more gifts during life. So it's a sort of a nice balance and synergy when you do this well. If you don't do it well, that's another factor. So why would a charity not want to be trustee, or what are some of the difficulties? A lot of them are just donor relations issues. The donor might be limited in the right to change charitable beneficiaries or trustee. The private letter rulings that allow endowment investment options require the charity to be the 100% beneficiary and be trustee. So again, if the donor may want to flip in, flip out between trustees, that could be an issue. Now, the other question is, the CRT large enough to shop it around? There's always a cost benefit analysis for the charity. You don't really want to do this in-house. You want your staff dealing with donor stewardship, basic issues, but you don't want them having to do the tax returns and other work. You want an outside provider. So there are fiduciary duties, which means the charity as trustee is liable. But the reality is most of these charities will use a very competent administrator, all the national players. And, if some malfeasance occurs, the liability is going to pass to that agent for trust services. Our next slide, briefly, we'll touch on early termination or partial assignment of income for CRTs. Number one, if you do this, you get a new income tax deduction for the donor because this is a new outright gift of an income interest. If it's a gift of the entire CRT income interest, the CRT collapses and the principal can go to work for the charity immediately. Second, if it's a gift of a partial income interest, state laws typically provide that the CRT income stream will go to the charity, but I was surprised years ago to find this. Some state laws actually allow a piece of the pie of the charitable remainder trust principal to be paid out to the charity immediately. Either way, an appraisal is required. The number of providers can do this, and the donor gets to make an immediate impact and see the gift at work, meet a student on scholarship, or a kid being saved by medical care, or a professor solving global warming, whatever the case, but that can often lead to additional gifts. Now, as Paul noted earlier this week, securities markets run-ups can really help make this more attractive because donors often have a bigger CRT than they thought they were going to have some years ago. Right now, the Dow Jones is around 30,000, but it was 16,000 a couple of years ago. We still are in the midst of a run up. We're just not at 36,000 still. And I also want to mention this is a solution for crashing CRATs or CRUTs. Now, that's a CRT that's cannibalizing its principal due to poor investment performance or high payout or both. So you can either donate the entire income interest, which is the charity's preference, and get a new income tax deduction, or do a bargain sale in the form of a life income interest to fund a charitable gift annuity. And there are a lot of private letter rulings allowing this. I've also used this bargain sale solution as an outright payment to cash out a CRT. I paid $100,000 for the donor's life income interest with his bride. It was $500,000, but he just wasn't happy with the trust performance, and he was angry about this, and he complained a lot. So, we asked him to make it right. And with that, Paul, I'll pass it back.
Thank you. I'm just going to touch on Charitable Solutions, CRT services, and we can come back to this slide if we have a few minutes at the end as we close here. But they're really kind of two separate services. One is that if your organization doesn't serve as a trustee and you want to help move the gift conversation forward, Charitable Solutions will do that. So that's on the left-hand side of your screen, that basically the liquid funding with cash and marketable securities. And you can review this information later on our website if you'd like. I would say on the right-hand side, this is where we can help the bulk of you, especially those who, serve as trustee traditionally, whether you're at Duke or University of Florida, where I spent the last 10 years, or Iowa State before that. We serve as trustee, but there are many times where the assets are going to have a lot of thorny issues. And we have to decide whether or not we want to go through all of the time and effort on the front end of that pre-flip to be there, and is the risk worth it? And so that's where Charitable Solutions for the last 2 decades have come in and been able to accept these types of gifts, work them through the system, get them liquidated. And this is no different. You were just doing this under the confines of a CRT instead of under the Decamai Foundation Donor Advice Fund. So that's essentially how our services work. And then, of course, post-flip, we can resign as trustee, and you can be off and running to serve as trustee yourself. I want to just mention, I mentioned Plan Giving Interactive, which is my separate company to Charitable Solutions. We have a close relationship, and we have a vertical software for the plan giving industry. One of the software tools is called Gift Docs, and within Gift Docs, you can draft Charitable Remainder Trust. You can draft Testamentary Charitable Remainder Trust exactly the way that I described them earlier, as intentionally revocable at the onset. You could do a number of things there, but the bottom line that I wanted to drive home here is that CASPIC did a survey, and CASPIC's obviously the gold standard in organizations that help us to be trustee on these types of life income gifts. And they were just curious of their clients. Are there clients that don't provide any templates whatsoever, that they shy away from that? And when I first got to the University of Florida, that was exactly our practice. They wanted nothing to do with that. I was able to socialize the idea over time of being able to provide these documents and why the advantages were so strong for doing that. And so you could see that the more that an organization is willing and able to draft that initial document just to get the ball rolling, whether the donor's attorney has experience or not, is just critical to closing CRTs. But it's also critical that you protect yourself. You're not providing tax, legal, or investment advice. And so there are other supporting documents, again, that you're not going to find just in the IRS specimen documents that protect yourself, to make sure that the donor understands you're not providing advice. So that could be a memorandum of understanding, other types of supporting documents that you have there. So, when we started drafting CRTs, and we have an in-house attorney who is tremendous, but it would take him a day because he would go to the IRS's website and start drafting it the old-fashioned way. And so it gave me an idea to go out and create a software platform where you could draft it literally in 15 minutes. And then, of course, you may have to make some adjustments to that draft. There's a famous author out there, David Allen. He wrote a book called Getting Things Done, probably one of the most highly sold books under time management. And he says that your mind is for having ideas, not holding them. And that's one of the reasons why I've created some of these applications at Plan Giving Interactive, is that, you know, our time is best spent to be in front of donors and not spending an entire hour or an entire day drafting trusts or doing research, when you can have apps that can help you expedite the process of those types of mundane things that you do. So with that, I think we're at our time. And Brian, if you want to talk about our past webinars and bring us in for a landing, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. Not really. You guys can look at the past webinars there. I appreciate you bringing it up. So obviously this will be another one that we'll be adding to the list, and just really want to thank Paul and Phil for a lot of content, a lot of good content. And as both have said, you know, obviously there are a lot more layers to the onion, both initial layers and sort of deeper layers, but we do hope, again, the last 50 minutes have been helpful to you. And just, again, really want to appreciate Paul and Phil's both technical expertise, but to be blunt, sort of practical expertise around this stuff too, which is in many cases lost. So thank you all for your time. We'll be, again, sending out, I've got a couple Q&As that came through that I was not able to answer. I was answering them as quickly as I could. But again, we will consolidate those with the Tuesday ones, and then that will come out probably early next week as soon as I can get home to Florida, with the link for the webinar as well as the Q&A. So again, thank you so much for your time. And again, Bill, Paul, thanks so much again.
Thanks, everyone.